got a very special guest with me to talk to us a bit about vultures, and it's Dr. Patrick Benson, and I'm really happy to have him joining us here by the fire. Thank you very much for joining us.
That's a pleasure.
I'm really excited about this fireside chat, I must admit.
Good.
And we've been talking all day, and there's definitely a lot of interesting information coming out, so I'm hoping we're going to hear a bit of it. But if you'd like to ask any questions throughout the chat, please feel free to send questions through, and send them through to finalcontrol@safari.tv. And if there is anything that springs to mind, then definitely send it through, and we'll be able to ask Dr. Benson here in real time. So
My name's
give it
Pat.
a go. Patrick. Okay, sorry. Being polite.
Okay.
But so I'm going to be passing over to you, but how on earth did you get into research and things like that? Because that's basically what you're doing out here at the moment, isn't it?
It is. I've been interested in raptors all my life.
Mm-hmm.
I once swore I'd never study vultures, which doomed me, I'm sure. But yeah, I had been working on raptors in the western United States, and at a Raptor Research Foundation meeting, I met a nutritionist from the University of California, Davis, and who had been here, and I knew about Cape vultures because I'd been looking at electrocutions of raptors, and Cape vultures do get electrocuted on power lines. And we talked, and within about 5 minutes I was coming to Africa for 8 months then, and now it's 30 years later.
Yeah, I had a bit of the same scenario as well, but
I think it's a common story.
I think it is. Something gets into your blood about Africa,
Yeah.
and you can't leave. But so in particular, what vultures are you studying?
I've been looking mainly at Cape vultures, which is a southern African endemic. In other words, it's found only in southern Africa. It's one of the 8 birds of the genus Gyps. They're all old world species, in other words, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They're specialists on soft tissues of large ungulates, the wildebeest, the springbuck. In India, they're blackbuck. And they have a very long neck, which allows them to reach inside a carcass. They have a very sharp beak. They have a specialized tongue with barbs that face backwards, so that they can push the food into their throat and into their crop very quickly. They're usually nesting in either colonies or loose associations. The Cape vulture is a cliff nester. We have cliff nesters and tree nesters. The cliff nesters usually are larger. The Cape vulture, in southern Africa we have the Cape vulture.
I think we've got a picture of the vulture on the nest, if we can have a look at that quickly while we're talking about that.
They are up to as much as 11 kilograms in weight, with about a 2.5 meter or 8.5 foot wingspan. The whiteback vulture is smaller, with about a 2 meter or 6 foot wingspan, weighs about 5 to 6 kilograms. So whitebacks are living in trees, Cape vultures are living on cliffs. Oftentimes you'll see them together. They can be difficult to identify if you don't know the birds well. The adult Cape vulture's got a yellow eye, but the young birds are very similar. They've got streaking, both the whiteback and the Cape. And
if we can just show the picture, because you took a beautiful picture, and that was the one that I really wanted to use, of how to distinguish between the whiteback and the Cape vulture. So hopefully you're having a look at this now. So you're saying that the yellow eye of the Cape vulture and the whiteback has the dark eye.
Has a dark eye.
Yeah.
But they both, as young birds, have dark eyes.
Oh, okay.
And that streaking on both the whiteback and the Cape is there as a young bird. It disappears completely in a Cape vulture, and so it becomes a kind of a creamy brown or tan sort of color, as it does in the whiteback, but there's faint streaks in the whiteback vulture. So, but it's much smaller, and when you get them together, it's pretty easy to tell them apart. But when you see one at a distance, particularly young birds, it's difficult. And flying in the air is difficult. Although there's an interesting difference, which that you can see if they're close enough flying. The thumb, or the alula, or sometimes called the bastard wing, it moves. It really is the thumb of the bird. And in a Cape vulture, it's dark against light feathers either side, whereas in the whiteback, it's pretty much the same color. So if they're close enough in the air, you can even identify them there. But usually, if they're any higher, it's almost impossible.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And obviously the blue patches. I mean, that was what the big feature on that picture actually was, the big blue patches of the Cape Vulture.
Yeah, they've got much bigger. They call them eye spots, or it's bare skin.
Mm. I would say I love that picture. When you showed it, I was like, yes, we've got to use that one. So also, I mean, you were talking about the features of the vultures, and obviously the long neck going into the carcass. And obviously the feathers as well, that's got a lot to do with the hygiene, hasn't it?
Right, very, very little feathering on the head. A bit of down feathers when the birds are young. They have very long hair-like, very stiff feathers. And the birds are actually quite clean, particularly the capes. They like to bathe. And yeah, and they're actually incredibly clean, considering what they do. But whitebacks not so much. They're a bit smaller. Sometimes they'll crawl right inside carcasses, and they get pretty mucked up. But again, they like to go bathe.
Yeah. And do they actually all go sort of in one, or do one or two go down?
Depends. Sometimes they're in groups. Sometimes you'll find individual birds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do they actually? Because I've never actually seen a vulture bathe. How do they actually go? Do they all go in, or is it just sort of wade in a little bit and throw a bit of water over?
Well, they'll get right in the water if it's not. And one of the problems that we have in South Africa is these big round farm dams. Sometimes the birds will get on the edge and they don't know how deep they are. And they'll jump completely in and they can't get out. And Mark Anderson, head of BirdLife South Africa, has done a lot of work with this, and they can put in boards that the birds can actually get out and crawl out. And so a lot of farmers are doing that now. But no, they'll go right into the water.
Sure, I'd love to see that. I'm looking forward to trying to see that at least. But we also do have a picture of the white-backed, just to show you the difference on what was the carcass?
There was an elephant carcass. There were 3 young white-backed vultures.
Yeah, okay. And you can't actually see the white-back unless the wings are out. That's
well, those are young birds, so they don't have a white-back, actually.
Yeah.
It's only as an adult.
It's actually at the front as well.
It's the front, yeah.
But if you actually do see a bird with the back, they've actually got the white between the shoulder blades. But I think we have a question.
Okay.
What is the mortality rate of vulture hatchlings compared to American hatchlings?
Okay, and what is the mortality rate between hatchlings compared to America and Africa? And that's from Randy.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't tell you that much about the American vultures. Are very different because you've got in North America you've got 3 vultures. You've got the California condor, which there's very few, and they're reintroducing those into the wild, including in the Grand Canyon. The Peregrine Fund and the LA Zoo and San Diego Zoo have all been very involved with that. They've had real high mortality, but they're reintroducing the birds. There's a problem. In fact, lead is a big problem with adults as well. But they are individual nesters. They're not colonial nesters, as are the other birds, which are smaller birds, about the size of our hooded vultures here, or Egyptian vultures, which stand about like this. And it's the turkey vulture and the black vulture. I'm not an expert on those birds. I'm sure it probably depends on where they are. I mean, I've seen the mortality in the Cape vultures here has varied quite a bit year to year. I've had as low as about 37% fledgling success and as high as 70%.
Sure.
Now, part of that's a bit deceptive because oftentimes it's been different numbers of breeding pairs to begin with. So if you've got low numbers, and because it seems to be food related, if there's a lot of food around, then the birds do well. And there's a number of factors that affect that. One of them is weather. When everybody else is doing well, in other words, whether there's lots of rainfall and the ungulates, the wildebeest and springbuck, when they're doing well, there's not much mortality, so there's not a lot of food for vultures. But when there's a drought, and I call it a good drought. Farmers tell me there is no such thing, but they don't study vultures. But then there's the birds do better. I suspect it's two things. I think adult body condition is very important because at the peak of the growth rate, the nestling's eating almost a kilogram of food, which is 2.2 pounds a day.
Sure.
And the adult is actually losing weight because he needs more than he's getting because he's feeding it to his chick. So so that is at that peak period, there's this huge demand, and if there's high mortality in ungulates, then it's much easier to feed those young. And so, like I say, it varies depending on year to year and the numbers of birds that are out there.
Yeah. And just to go on to what you're actually doing at the moment, you're working quite a lot in Tabazimbi, you were saying.
Yeah, I've been looking at that. There's a big colony there. When I said 1,000 pairs, almost 1,000 pairs in 1984. There were 961 active nests. In other words, where birds laid an egg. And today this year it's about 750 pairs.
Sure.
Now it dropped down to about 600 pairs in 2003, and it's come back. And it's quite interesting. The numbers of chicks that actually fledged, the nestlings that fledged, seems to have leveled out before, dropped and then kind of leveled out. It varies year to year again, but the numbers of breeding pairs has dropped and then come back. So I think they're just adjusting to the amount of food that's available.
Well, let's hope so. And that was the Cape Vultures.
That's Cape Vultures.
Yeah. And where's the place that you were? What's the mountain that they're on?
It's called the Kronsberg.
Kronsberg.
We
have a picture of that as well.
Yeah, it's the southwestern corner of the Waterberg. It's about 20 kilometers from Tabazimbi, and it's in Limpopo province.
Okay, so it's basically where we are. It's what, roughly about sort of direct line. It would be about 4 hours. Would it be?
It'll take longer than that.
A little bit longer.
It's we're kind of in the east of the northern part of South Africa, and it's about 60 kilometers from the Botswana border.
Yeah.
So it'll probably take 5-6 hours to get there anyway.
Yeah, quite far then. But I've got a question here from Brian, and he would like to know the bare patches on the vultures, on the Cape Vultures. Does it serve any purpose, like thermoregulation or anything like that?
I'm sure there's a bit of thermoregulation because they do like most of the birds that have those bare spots. They do change colors a bit. I think the neck is probably more useful in thermoregulation because it's a long bare neck. And as I told you earlier, sometimes when it's very hot, the birds will actually put their back to the sun and hang their neck down in the shade of their own body. There's, we think we know a lot about these birds, any animal, and but there's a lot of speculation that it's. In fact, there's some pictures you'll see where it almost looks like eye spots if you look at the body of a lion, and I think that's probably a lot of that. There's a lot of interactions between birds. Also, they probably can judge each other's temperament at the moment by what those look like. It probably has kind of dual purposes. Some thermoregulation, probably behavioral as well, both intra and interspecific.
Yeah. So I'm getting a bit worried about these potatoes.
Yeah,
we're going to have to turn them. Unfortunately, I was making a little bit of noise while you were talking, so apologies for that. But we're treating you to a bride this evening.
I believe so. I believe you like to burn potatoes.
I do.
Or not cook them at all, one or the other.
Yeah. I think it's usually the undercooking, so it takes quite a while.
Well, I'm just the opposite. I usually burn them.
So yeah, so you've been helping me a bit with this one.
So they should be perfect.
Yeah. It's so you were talking a bit about the colony in Tabazimbi, but you were also saying that there was a colony fairly close to us.
There is. We have the Drakensberg Mountains here. Most people think about Natal when you talk about the Drakensberg, but this is what is now what was called the Transvaal Drakensberg. It's an extension into the clear up into Limpopo province, and it's the third largest colony. It's varied in numbers. It's about a little over 500 pairs, and it's the only real big north-facing colony,
Okay.
which means it gets sun all day.
Yeah.
And most of the rest of them are south-facing or some variation of that. And it's quite interesting to watch these. I've spent quite a bit of time at the Manutsa colony, and you'll see in the middle of winter when it's cool, that the cliff gets quite warm, and you'll see adults shading their young, and you'll see this behavior of the birds hanging their neck down in the shadow of their own body, and you don't see that shading, you don't see those behaviors at Tabazimbi, which is south-facing, until late in the season, when the sun has moved further south, and there's actually sun on the cliffs.
Okay, so there's quite a difference in behaviour at certain times of year.
And these cliffs are huge cliffs. They're kind of stepped, but it's about 350 meters from top to bottom, whereas the Tabazimbi cliffs are more sheer, and it's about 200 meters.
Yeah.
So big cliffs.
Yeah. And so you, because I was talking to you earlier and saying, can we actually get the Cape vultures here? So
Certainly.
Quite possibly from that.
I've trapped Cape vultures in the Kruger National Park and marked them, and you don't see a lot here. You do see them though, and you'll see both adults and young. You see more young ones here. Young birds are not tied to the cliffs so much because they don't have young to raise. And remember, that colony also is surrounded by communal grazing areas. So, although birds do come here, I suspect that most of their foraging is in those communal grazing areas, like I mentioned before. And so the young birds can go anywhere. We know that they move thousands of kilometers, and so it's easy for them to come here. And they're not in the numbers that you'll see the whiteback vultures in parks, but they're certainly here.
Yeah. And also, just on that, what is the status of vultures at the moment? As you were saying, sort of endangered, sort of gets a bit overused sometimes.
Yeah, the term endangered is oftentimes misused. There's very specific criteria for red data species, and the Cape vulture is classified as threatened, and I believe all of the vultures, well, except for the Egyptian vulture, which has never been common here, and in South Africa, and has only been recorded in a few places. That's a different category, but the others are I believe they're all threatened now. But remember that a whiteback vulture goes all the way through sub-Saharan Africa, so it's found quite widely, as are the other birds.
Yeah.
So, but it's they aren't quote unquote endangered. They're actually threatened.
Threatened, yeah. So they could go into that endangered category, but they're not quite there yet.
Yeah, you get threatened, and then you get endangered, and then you get critically endangered.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got a question here from Randy, and Randy would like to know: can vultures hunt for themselves, or are they purely scavengers?
Well, that's a good question. There's of course different species doing different things. You get something like the small hooded vulture he's not really set up for any sort of hunting. He usually picks small pieces of meat up. He also eats the scat of things like lions and other things, because there's a lot of nutrition in those, and bones and all sorts of things. There have been some records of some vultures actually killing things, but lappet-faced vultures and white-headed are the two that most people think about this sort of behavior. Lappet-faced vultures have been known to go into flamingo colonies and take young and eggs. There's a lot of speculation. People will see a lappet-faced vulture on a carcass of a small animal, say a francolin or a small mammal, and people will say, well, he must have killed it. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Most vultures are great pirates. They'll steal from each other, and the lappets are probably the best pirates, and they will run other birds off carcasses. They'll even sometimes chase jackals off carcasses.
Sure.
So just because you don't see another bird there, say a tawny eagle, which may have killed something, doesn't mean that the lappet killed it. It could have run something else off. But again, who knows?
Could be, yeah.
You actually need to see it to really know.
Yeah, and I think you were saying some of the stories that you hear, there's a few holes in those stories.
Sure.
So, so I think we do have to be a bit careful about that one, I think. But as I say, it's nice to actually hear, your side of things, because too often we do sort of read things and you start to think, oh, that is true, that is definitely true because you've read it. And actually sometimes
Not
it can
always,
be misprinted. So
They do. No, a lappet and a white-headed vulture have much better feet for clasping things than, say, a gyps vulture, the whitebacks and the capes. And the other thing is there's been stories of these gyps vultures, the Eurasian Griffin, they say killing cattle. But usually when you hear the story, it's an animal that's sick and down and can't get up, or young animals that maybe are not going to survive, or sometimes people will see an animal on a stillborn, a bird on a stillborn, and if you come up afterwards, you don't really know.
yeah, exactly.
You have to be careful.
Yeah, you do. But why are vultures so important? I mean, they're becoming threatened, but why are they so important? I mean, can the world not do without vultures?
Well, you could probably do without vultures, but you might not like the alternatives. They clean up things. They will eat a carcass, and if it was left there, what would happen? The flies would get in it. You'd have maggots. You'd have more flies. So that's one thing. You can feed a vulture, a gyps vulture, a live anthrax bacteria, and that will die in his gut. Now the spore will pass through if it's sporulated, but if a vulture gets in there early, the spore won't form. So they can actually help prevent the disease. Now there's a lot of speculation as to whether they may spread it as well, but I think they probably do more good than not. And you look in places like South Asia where there's many animals that die, and the vultures were in huge numbers and cleaned up lots and lots of carcasses.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I'm sorry, I think I stole somebody else's question. I didn't quite catch who it was there, but apologies. Sorry, who was that? Robin. Sorry, Robin.
Hi, Robin.
Question. But see, great minds think alike, hey?
Yeah.
But I do have another question from Leslie this time.
Okay.
And she would like to know, how big are the vulture's eggs and what colour are they?
They are, Cape vulture eggs are about the size of a turkey egg, about like this, weighing about 250 grams, plus or minus. And the whiteback, even though it's smaller, there's a bit about the same, and they're kind of a whitish, creamish color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And how many would they usually lay, actually?
Normally they lay one,
Just the
but
one.
occasionally they do lay two. Oftentimes those two eggs don't hatch, but sometimes they do, but rarely. In fact, with over 20,000 nesting attempts, I only have one incident where it appears that both chicks survived, because the parents are very good. They take turns watching the chick and incubating, and so one bird's off foraging and the other one's taking care of the chick, staying with the chick all day. And when you start doing the sums, they really couldn't energetically sustain two chicks. Yeah.
But would you not get the side going on where one chick kills the other in that sense?
That doesn't seem to be work like it does with some of the eagles.
Yeah.
It's I think they squabble. Vultures definitely squabble, no doubt about it. But they're not aggressive like at that stage, like the young eagle is and the black eagle or some of the others.
Okay. So I'm definitely learning a lot here. But I'm just going to move on to the Peregrine Fund, because you're part of the Peregrine Fund.
Well, yeah, I'm not part of the Peregrine Fund,
Okay.
but I've worked with the Peregrine Fund, and the Peregrine Fund is helps support my research here, and then I've gone to South Asia with them as well.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask about that, because you have been doing a lot of work out there with the Asian vultures as well. So how did that all come about?
Well, there was South Asia was quite interesting, even though you've got quite a unique situation. You have the Hindus and the Hindu culture who reveres the cow.
Mm-hmm.
It's against the law to kill a cow. They don't eat a cow. And then in Pakistan, next door, you've got the Muslim population who, if an animal dies, they will eat a cow, but if it dies and isn't properly slaughtered, they won't touch it. It's haram. It's unclean. So, again, you've got huge numbers of animals. And in some areas, like in the Indus Plain in Pakistan, it's basically desert and it's got a lot of water at the moment because it's been flooded, but it's flat and it's desert, and it gets its rain through snowmelt, it gets its water through snowmelt mainly, and so there is oftentimes high mortality, and there they've planted a lot. They've got a lot of canals for flood control when the waters come down, and they planted trees along them, so there's lots of potential nest sites. And then, of course, India's got lots of forests, and there's places for them to nest. But so there were huge numbers of vultures, a lot of food, lots of places to nest, and then they started disappearing. People started noticing them dying. And Peregrine Fund, I was asked by Dr. Rick Watson, who is a South African now living in my hometown, Boise, Idaho, where the Peregrine Fund is based. I'd met him at FITS 30 years ago, and he said, would you like to go to Pakistan? And of course I said yes. And there's a fellow named Munir Varani who works for the Peregrine Fund, living in Nairobi. And he was kind of the point man because he speaks Hindi and Urdu. And I met Munir there, and a fellow named Lindsay Oakes, who's from Washington State University, who is a vet and got a PhD also in microbiology. And I met those fellows. We went there to try to set up a project, and then a fourth man came, Martin Gilbert, a Scotsman, who's also a vet. And then we worked with some of the Pakistanis at a university out of Multan. We had Pakistani students doing the work. And nobody knew what was killing these birds in the beginning. There was a lot of speculation. It was bacteria or virus. And ultimately, of course, this started in 2000. Of course, the 9/11 incident came about, and of course all the expats were pulled out. And it ended up these young Pakistani students who hadn't had any field experience prior to this project collected literally thousands of carcasses, and they were sent to Lindsay Oakes, who was in Washington State, and he started analyzing for the usual things like chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides, things like DDT or organophosphates, and then looked for bacteria, looked for viruses, and he didn't find any of these things. And so he said, well, let's make a list of what the farmers are using. There was a very specific symptom that we were seeing in these vultures, and when you cut them open, because they were in very good condition, but the crops were empty, you cut them open and all of their internal organs were covered with a white crystal.
Sure.
And it was uric acid, which indicates kidney failure. But many things can cause that. So Lindsay said, let's make a list of these chemicals, which was done. And he looked at it and he said, okay, what do we know causes it? And sodium diclofenac stood out, which we call Voltaren in this country and elsewhere. It's called a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. It's a painkiller, anti-inflammatory. And he went back and tested the samples, and every bird that had this symptom was positive for it. And every other bird, which we'd gotten some that were hit by cars and wires, they were all negative. And then there was a study done to inject a cow and slaughter it and feed it to the vultures, that we had some non-releasable vultures, and within 3 to 4 days, they died from kidney failure.
Sure.
So it was pretty, and it was published in Nature, and now the governments have accepted that this is the problem. India's banned the use of it banned the sale and manufacture of the drug for veterinary use, but it's still out in the environment today, and it's still killing vultures, unfortunately.
But I mean, why is it still available? I mean,
well, it wasn't banned for human use.
Yeah. Okay.
And so people still get a hold of it, and it's being sold in some of the veterinary shops there.
Sure.
And it says for human use. It's the same drug.
Yeah. So it's still out there.
It's
the vultures
still out
can
there.
still be poisoned by it,
Yes.
and other birds.
Yeah,
that's
the
what you're
vultures are
saying.
still declining in numbers.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sharon wants to know which other drugs are possibly being used that are affecting the vultures as well.
Well, there's all of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Not all of them have been tested. We know that there's one called meloxicam, which seems to be vulture friendly.
Okay.
There are many of these, and not all of them have been tested, and that's the problem. There could be other drugs out there that could be affecting. There's a lot of other chemicals that are used that also can damage vultures. You know, there's been a lot of poisoning in this country, not generally specifically in the commercial farming areas, that not specifically for vultures, but a farmer will put poison on a whole carcass to try to kill jackals or caracal, sort of thing, and that's really bad for vultures because they're the first ones to come down, and many vultures have been killed that way. It's not as bad as it used to be because the farmers are much more aware now, and they're using alternative methods, and but it used to be strychnine used to be the old poison of choice. That's not so much around anymore, but other drugs have been or other chemicals have been used, agricultural chemicals. There's also been poisoning for the muti trade. Nobody really knows how much that is. It's very different. In fact, even the commercial farming poisonings are very difficult to monitor.
Yeah. And just what is muti for those people?
It's it's some of the African tribes believe that certain parts of vultures and other animals can be used to, particularly in vultures, it appears to be the brains and the hearts. I'm not sure exactly how they're used, but they can help you predict the outcome of the horse races or the lottery or the World Cup.
Yeah. Okay.
And there was a lot of worrying about how vultures would be affected by having the soccer World Cup here.
But you were saying that to me earlier that just through the poisonings at the moment, well, in the farmers and the carcasses, it's not the main negative impact on it.
Yeah, it's changes in land use anywhere in the world. Commercial farming areas are very efficient.
Yeah.
And they're usually, if an animal dies, which usually they don't have many animal dies, or otherwise they aren't commercially viable because they're injected and they're checked regularly. But most of those are tested to see what the problem is, and then they're usually burned or buried. In the communal grazing areas, usually there's higher stocking rates, there's many more animals per acre or hectare. So the veld conditions, the grass conditions are not so good. And particularly here in southern Africa, where we have a lot of drought and really dry and a dry winter, there's high mortality. And that's why the vultures, the big Cape vulture colonies, are all usually found near these communal grazing areas. And that seems to be the biggest problem, is the amount of food. But what happens is when the numbers are dropped, then poisoning becomes a bigger factor because you're affecting a higher proportion of the population than if you've got lots of vultures around. Namibia's got a big problem with poisoning, and there's no active breeding at the Cape vulture colonies in that country.
Sure. Yep. I didn't quite copy who that was from. Grand Mature. I think that's how you say your name. Grand Mature would like to know the lifespan of a vulture.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Sorry, do vultures mate for life? But sorry, I got that one confused.
You should be asking the vulture that.
Yeah.
We know that birds will often use the same nest site year after year. The big problem we have with this is it's not easy to identify individuals at a distance, particularly. If you see them up close and you get to know them, then that's one thing. I had a bird that I marked was at the same nest site for 12 years after I marked it, and who knows how long before then.
Yeah.
But I also had another bird that I marked one year, was at the Drakensberg, and the following year was in the Mullet, a mountain range about 140 kilometers south, and the third year he was in Botswana. Now, I don't know if he bred in the Mullet, but he certainly bred in Botswana.
Okay.
And it appears that they probably are breeding for life, mated for life, but it appears they also will replace a mate if one dies. It's one of the questions that we really don't know. I mean, the problem with marking vultures is, particularly, any of these big vultures, is the techniques we have don't last very long.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a lot of color ringing in the vultures here, and the vultures take them off. So you often see birds with one or two color rings, and you don't know who he is. I did some wing tagging, and after about 4 or 5 years, it's the same thing. They pull on the wing tags, and they start to disappear. So it's very difficult to really to measure that. And if you had everybody marked and you had a good technique, then it would be easier to tell.
Easier. And how you're probably going to pull a face at me, but how long is a vulture supposed to live for?
Yeah. Okay, that's the question.
That was the question.
I had one that a marked bird, and I think it was the same bird. But again, this is speculation. And I reckoned it had to be at least 21 years.
Sure.
Now,
Okay.
birds, in zoos, we know that some birds have lived a very long time, 50, 60 years, big birds. And we know that birds, if you take, say, a mouse, which lives probably 2 years is a long time for a mouse. If you take a bird that's the same size, it will live many times, many years longer, sometimes 10, 15 years, depending on where it is and the conditions. And so they can live much longer. I'm sure that when you think that these birds, the earliest recording of a Cape vulture breeding is 4 years old.
Yeah.
So for him to die, after 5 or 10 years wouldn't seem really a practical thing evolutionarily. So they're probably living 30, 40, maybe 50 years. I've known other large raptors living 40 years, eagles, and I think that's probably, but if you want to go average, then it's very short, because you get high mortality early on.
Yeah.
And, but, once they get past their independence point, then mortality, unless it's poisoning or that sort of thing, is pretty low. So they're probably living 30, 40 years anyway.
Yeah. So what are you actually busy with at the moment? What's the research actually moving towards?
Well, I'm trying to get some of my writing done. I'm way behind on that. But I'm monitoring the Drakensberg colony. I've got on that cliff, I've got photos of the cliff and have mapped it out. I've got over 3,200 sites which I've given alphanumeric codes to and marked on these photos, and I have now a 30-year history of these sites. And I'm continuing to monitor. I go every month. Sometimes, this year I was there for about 2.5 months straight, in May, June, and July, and then I just came back from there, spent about 10 days last month, and I'm headed up there in another about 8 days for another 10 days. And so I'm still looking at when things happen, when eggs are laid, when they hatch, if they don't hatch, what productivity is, trying to get an idea of long-term patterns. Because with changes in land use, with changes in weather, with changes in politics, the vultures are affected by all of this.
Yeah, sure. Sounds quite a handful though.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It just takes a long time to see the patterns.
Yeah,
It's,
but you do need a good long period to actually see that.
With a bird that lives a long time, any animal that lives a long time, to study it for 1 or 2 or 3 years gives you some information. Depends on what aspect you're looking at, but you can't learn. I mean, it's like studying humans, for 5 years and saying, well, we know everything there is about humans.
Yeah.
We don't. We don't know about what's the geriatric behavior of humans and how long they're going to live. So, you really long-term studies are necessary for these animals.
No, I definitely agree with that. And I just want to go back to the Asian species,
Right.
because you were talking about the gyps species, and how many species do you say are in the world?
There are eight species of gyps vulture. They're all found in Asia, Africa, or Europe.
Okay. And how many do we have here?
Well, mainly we have two, the Cape vulture and the African whiteback vulture. But we have had a Ruppel's vulture, which is considered a central and a species that showed up at the Blowberg colony, which is north of Polokwane, about 100 kilometers. And it started breeding with a Cape vulture. And there was one that visited. I suspect it's probably the same bird. Was at Kransberg. For 3 years I observed a bird there. And then it was run off at a site, and I was there 1 year, the last year, and seemed to be at this site, and then it was run off by a pair, and that was the first year that the Ruppel's bred with a Cape vulture. And it's only 218 kilometers in a straight line, and that's a very short distance for this bird. So I suspect it was probably the same bird. Could have been a different bird, but so that's the third one, but it's not common here.
Yeah, and was the offspring viable, or did it?
It raised young. Whether they're fertile or not, nobody knows.
Yeah.
But I suspect they probably were.
Wow.
They're pretty close with the Eurasian Griffin, the Ruppel's vulture, the Cape vulture are very similar sizes, and they obviously came from the same frame stock originally, and they've just stopped in different places and evolved a few different characteristics, but they're still pretty much the same birds. So.
Yeah. And then in Asia, I think we've got some pictures of these as well, if we can put them up as we're talking about.
Okay, well we have in India you get 5 of the gyps species. You get the 3 that we know that have become critically endangered, which is the Indian or Oriental whiteback vulture, which is a tree nester, and is about the same size as our whiteback here. The long-billed vulture, which is also about the same size, but he lives on the cliffs. And then we have the long-billed vulture, which is a tree nester, and also a little bit smaller, but about the same size. Those are all critically endangered.
Okay.
And they're found in South Asia and a little bit into East Asia only. And then you get Himalayan vulture, which of course lives in the Himalayas and is up to 12 kilograms. And it does come down into southern India, some in the winter, and occasionally you'll see birds even other times of the year, but they're usually young birds. How affected they are by diclofenac, we don't know. Nobody knows. But I suspect they're a little more remote. They're doing a little different sort of thing in their lifestyle. And then you get the Eurasian Griffin, who is found widespread, found in North Africa, found in Europe, found in parts of Asia. And you'll see that bird there as well, but usually only in the winter. And of course then they're going to be impacted potentially by diclofenac.
Yeah. So it's still going to be a bit of a problem for them.
It is, yeah.
For sure. And how do the gyps vultures, how do they differ from other vultures then? I mean, what
Well, they have this. Like I say, they're specialists on soft tissues, reaching inside carcasses with that long neck, and that very sharp beak, and a specialized tongue, eating muscle, eating internal organs. The other birds, like in Africa, you've got the lappet-faced vulture, has a very wide gape, as white-headed also got a fairly large gape compared to the gyps vultures, who have narrow heads. They can a lappet face can eat I'm working on a paper now. We've got 42 mammal species that we've recorded them feeding on. We've got bird species, francolin, guinea fowl, snakes, lizards, the monitor lizards, the legavan as we call it here in South Africa. And so they're eating a lot of different things. They will eat hard parts. They're big, lappet-faced vultures are big bone eaters. They eat hard tissues, but if they get the opportunity, they're eating meat as well. They don't seem to get into the big scrabble with big numbers of the gyps vultures. The whitebacks, you may get hundreds of birds on a carcass, and they usually the lappets stand away. If it's one-on-one, then they often will dominate the birds, or even one on a few. White-headeds, similar, but not as aggressive. To me, they probably would be the one, if you're going to look at predation, are probably set up the best. They're the most eagle-like. They're very agile in the air compared to the lappet-faced vulture. A similar species, the red-headed vulture in India, is it superficially looks very much like a lappet because it's that red head and it's got lappets, but it's size-wise it's closer to the white-headed, and behaviorally it's more similar. There's a fellow that actually photographed a red-headed vulture killing a young long-billed vulture.
Wow.
He didn't chase it though. They were at a watering point, and this young bird didn't move away, and the bird just jumped on top of him and started pulling away.
Sure.
So, as I say, they're not chasing things that are fast. But if any of them were, then it would probably be the white-headed and maybe the red-headed in India. But they're eating a wider variety of animals than, say, the gyps vultures that are mainly specialists. The gyps vultures do eat other things as well, but not nearly as much as the other vultures. And then, of course, the small ones, things like hooded vultures and Egyptian vultures, as I mentioned, they eat dung of things like lions. They pecking small pieces of meat. They'll eat insects. They'll eat small vertebrates, that sort of thing.
Yeah, quite a varied diet, actually.
They are. You don't pass a meal up.
No,
if you do, you're in
not.
trouble. You're not going to survive.
And if you can just clear one thing up, I was asking you a bit earlier about the largest vulture. If you can kind of clear that one up for us.
Okay.
We had quite a big debate going on.
Yeah, the largest vultures. The two biggest vultures are the Himalayan vulture, which is found in the Himalaya, and the Andean condor, which is in the New World in South America. A different group of birds. They're both vultures, but they're not very closely related. And they're all, a Himalayan vulture will go up to about 12 kilograms.
Sure.
So he's a big bird,
Very large bird.
And the Andean condor is about the same. It's probably, most people would probably say the Andean condor is the biggest. I think that's probably what you see in the books. But, individuals are different. You
Yeah.
get big individuals, you and I don't weigh the same.
Yeah, no, for sure. So thanks for clearing that one up.
Yeah,
As
it's
I
a
did
pleasure.
start quite a big debate on that one. And are condors or vultures and that sort of thing. So actually, why not call it an Andean vulture? Is it just because they are quite separate?
Oh, the condor part.
Mm.
I don't know I don't know where the name condor came from.
No.
You've got the California condor, which is very famous for almost going extinct and now recovering, and then the Andean condor, and that's the only two. I should actually look that up and find out where that came from. But they are vultures.
Yeah.
They're more closely related to storks than our birds are. Ours are more eagle-like. But it's convergent evolution, two groups of birds that have come together to do fill the same niche and do the same thing.
Just in different countries.
Different countries, different areas, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this
pleasure.
chat.
I've enjoyed it as well.
I really hope everybody else at home has. And yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful. It's been an absolute
Thank you
pleasure.
very much. I
And
appreciate it.
thanks everybody for all the questions. We did extend it a little bit just because it was such a fantastic topic, and as I say, we're really glad about that. And if you would like to watch it again, then obviously it will be in the archives as well. But as I say, thank you so much, Patrick. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. But from myself and the rest of the crew, I'm going to be saying good night, and hopefully you can join us tomorrow at 6 o'clock Central Africa time for our live safari. So do join us then. But goodbye for now.
Okay, sun is down.
Awesome.
There's no fire.
Fire, she died.
Potatoes are burning.
Patrick?
Yes, sir.
Often in the crew I've been on drive before and seen vultures with those yellow potato tags.
Yeah.
Recorded everything, eh?
Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of guys say if
There's
you see
no
them,
fire,
take
Herman.
record of where it is, GPS reading, take the number.
Sure.
Do we do this if we see one? Where do we send it to? You know, so we can get the people, because a lot of them come to this part of the world.
Yeah, there's, I think those